Hi, we're recording, and here I am having my breakfast cup of tea early in the morning, but I'm still managing to talk to Stuart Traynor in Wollongong. And what time is it there, Stuart?
It's now gone 7:45. The sun is gone down. The sky's still got a bit of light in it. We're coming to the end of summer. A very warm day today. It was a 33 degrees, a last burst of summer, but we've had a strange summer because we've had a La Nina event in the Northern Pacific, which meant an unusually wet period. So it hasn't been a warm summer, but today was real beach weather.
Wow, that's amazing to us. So here we are in February, which is winter time for us. Just first signs of spring, though. We're getting buds coming out with daffodils. Yeah, it's looking pretty grey out there this morning, I have to say. Well,
so in Alice Springs at the moment today, it was 40 degrees. So that's the sort of conditions that our friend William Whitfield Mills faced in 1871. On the 11th of March, when he made a ride through the Alice Springs area. But before we talk about that, it's important, I think, to recognise the geography that he was dealing with. And Australia is the driest continent on Earth, with large areas of sandy desert. And there's a number of actual classic deserts: the Great Sandy Desert, the Gibson, the Great Victoria, the Simpson, and the Sturt Stony Desert, and they account for 1/3 of the continent. But despite the general arid nature, the very centre of Australia, while it's dry, is actually something of an oasis in the desert with quite good vegetation. And that's due to the fact that it is the remnants of an ancient mountain range. And 350 million years ago, there was a mountain range the height of the Canadian Rockies in the heart of Australia. But it's sort of been all downhill since then. Basically, you've had 350 million years of erosion, and those old massive mountain ranges have been reduced to remnants. And if we look at what's left now, this is the Mcdonald Rangers. It's stunningly beautiful country in the heart of Australia. And as I said, it's not people's vision of the desert area that surrounds the very centre. And again, the highest points of the old ancestral McDonald's reach up into the sky on average about 300 and 350 metres. So basically you've had this huge mountain range the size of the Rockies being worn down to basically bare bones. And on average, you're getting about 250 millimetres of rain a year in the Alice Springs area, but averages are quite meaningless because if you look at the rainfall over the last 100 years, for example, 70% of the years have below average rainfall. So to say we get 250 millimetres a year is really only a statistical issue, and most years you'll get less than that. But what's amazing is that despite that, the slow evolution of this dry country has evolved a very rich flora. And so a lot of people who come from deserts overseas are surprised by the amount of vegetation that is in the Australian dry country. And there's lots of gorges and gaps within the ranges which are very hospitable and with good water. And one of them is Ormiston Gorge, which is 130 kilometres west of Alice Springs. And I actually think after living in the centre for 40 years, I still consider Ormiston Gorge the most stunning place. And this photo doesn't do justice to it. It's just a stunning gorge cut through these remnants of the Mcdonald Rangers. But the reason I wanted to put this image up is it gives you an idea of what was facing young Mills, and he was only 25, in charge of building the central section of our Great Overland Telegraph line. He had to get it through these rugged ranges, and finding a suitable pass was quite an issue. So in many senses, Alice Springs is a sort of an oasis in the desert. And we see that from this image of Stanley Chasm, which is about 3/4 of an hour's drive west of the Alice Springs Township. So the very heart of the country, as I said earlier, is certainly not desert. Now, exactly 150 years ago on the 11th of March, Mills and two other men rode through this area, and they were the first white men to actually go into that area. John McDougall Stuart, the Scottish-born explorer, had been through roughly 10 years earlier, but further west. And so the significance for Alice Springs of the 11th of March and Mills' ride up the Todd River, as it was later named, effectively it is the beginning of white settlement in the heart of Australia. And why was Mills there? Well, he was a surveyor and he was looking for, as I mentioned, a route for the telegraph line to cross the Mcdonald Rangers. He was born in Norley Street, Plymouth on the 19th of November 1844, and he was the eldest of 7 children. We know that. We also know he migrated to South Australia in 1866 at the age of 21 with £4 in his pocket. And he joined the South Australian Survey Branch, and there he qualified as a certified surveyor. But as you and I have discussed, Jojo, his education is still somewhat of a mystery, and the fact that he might have done in Heavitree some basic surveying training is quite intriguing and something we need to certainly pursue. His boss, I should say, was a bloke called Charles Todd, who'd actually come out from England in the 1850s from the Greenwich Observatory, and he was recruited to head up South Australia's Telegraph branch and their post office. So he was the Postmaster General and the Superintendent of Telegraphs for the colony of South Australia. And at this time, we're talking about 1871, Australia is a set of self-governing British colonies. Federation of the country did not happen until 1901. So South Australia is a self-governing colony with a governor answerable to the British Home Office. And what was going on at that time was the laying of a submarine cable from Cornwall all the way through Suez, through the Mediterranean, across India, down to Singapore, and then into the Dutch East Indies, now known as Indonesia, and onto the north coast of Australia. And the South Australian government had done a deal with the British Australia Telegraph Company, a private company, because the British government itself kept refusing to spend the money on building this submarine cable link, not only to Australia, but obviously to India and to Singapore. So a private company had taken on laying a series of cables, and the South Australian colonial government, based in Adelaide, had agreed to build a telegraph line from the south coast up to the north coast to Port Darwin. And they signed a contract in the middle of 1870. They had only 18 months to string up 36,000 poles, 3,000 kilometres of wire, and to get this line to join by the time the cable was brought from Java in Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies, and landed on the coast at Port Darwin. So that's the background. And the wire was called the singing wire because it hummed as the electricity passed along it, particularly on a quiet night. People in the bush would talk about the humming of the wires. So the singing wire was the common name for the telegraph line once it was up and running. And the construction of this telegraph line to join the submarine cable was one of the greatest building achievements anywhere in the world in the 19th century. And it was Australia's first national development project. So it was huge because up until then, the only way you could communicate with Europe, with England in particular, was sending a letter and waiting months for a reply. So that was the task, and that was why young Mills was in the centre. Now, another surveyor had got to a gap in the range, which he named Temple Bar. The surveyor's name was Gilbert McMinn. He was Irish born. And he named this large gap in the first part of the Mcdonald Rangers Temple Bar. And I went to Temple Bar in Fleet Street, London, nearly 20 years ago, trying to find clues because he never told us why he named it Temple Bar. But the London Temple Bar was one of the toll gates run by the Knights Templar and the opening to the old city of London. So we can only assume that Gilbert McMinn, in finding this gap, and he could see a break in the ranges ahead, thought he must have found what they were looking for, which was a gateway through the rugged ranges to the mulga plains of the north through which they could build the line. But Mills at the time was out exploring further west. So these two surveyors, Gilbert McMinn and young William Whitfield Mills, had been poking around in McDonald's, and McMinn thought he'd found it. He went west and found Mills, and they went back 150 kilometres south of the area where all the men who were going to build the line were stuck for weeks waiting for the pass to be found. And then Mills was sent forward to actually check out the country that McMinn had found. So he arrives at this gap, Temple Bar, on the 10th of March, 1871. And he must have camped there. He doesn't give a lot of details in his report, but I think he camped on the southern side. And then he and his two companions, who he didn't name in his report, rode through the gap, not on this graded road that you can see in the photo I've got, but they rode through along the sandy creek bed, and then they headed east along the range to another even larger gap. And this was the one that he named Heavitree Gap, after the village of Heavitree. From there, the three men rode north, and that meant basically going up the dry bed of the river. And this is actually taken within the gap. So looking in the distance is looking north. So they headed up there, and after a distance of about 8 kilometres, they came to a string of waterholes. And what was working for them at the time is that this was an unusually wet year in Central Australian history, and a lot of rain had fallen. And the largest of the waterholes that the three men found, Mills decided he would call the Alice Spring. And it was named after Alice Todd, the wife of his boss, Charles Todd, though she never ever went to the waterhole or the town that bears her name. She spent all her life in Adelaide after migrating out with Charles Todd. They got married in England and then left on a ship and came to Adelaide. So she never visited her Alice Spring. At the moment, the waterhole is dry. It's been a series of dry years, and it's quite clear from changes in weather patterns in Australia that climate change is certainly happening. And in fact, I heard some interesting statistics before Christmas. A lot of our international, with all the international conventions that are being signed in the last few years, have been about limiting global warming to an average of 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Now, globally, we're 1 degree, but Australia is actually 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So Australia has actually been heating up quicker than other parts of the world. Antarctica, where I was in 2017, is also heating up very quickly, more than other parts. So it's not surprising that the Alice Spring is actually dry at the moment. But the interesting thing about rivers in Central Australia, they actually run upside down, and down beneath the sand there, the water is actually trickling through. So this might not look like a running river to people in England, but I can assure you there's water running under that sand beneath the Alice Spring. What Mills didn't know was that it was a place of some significance to the local Arunta Aboriginal people, and the waterhole to them was Atariura. That was its Arunta name. And it's actually crisscrossed with what we call dreaming tracks of spirit ancestors from the Altura, the creation era in Aboriginal spirituality. And certainly young Mills didn't talk to these blokes who were the custodians of Atariura. He didn't talk to them, and he certainly didn't ask permission to build a telegraph repeater station on their land next to their waterhole. He also had no idea that that big break in the range that he named Heavitree Gap was a very significant site for the Arunta. And up one side of the range, they actually stored sacred ceremonial religious objects from ceremonies, and no strangers were allowed to pass through there without permission. And in particular, a bloke called Njulka, who was the senior lawman, and women and children were never allowed to go through Heavitree Gap at all. Heavitree Gap is Intarapa. In Aboriginal pronunciation, there's no emphasis on any one syllable, so it's Intarapa. We tend to emphasise the second syllable, so we might say laboratory with emphasis on the second. But looking at these names, it is certainly just equal emphasis. So Intarapa is your Heavitree Gap. Now, Mills' section of the line that he had to build that covered the ranges was called subsection E. And basically, he had to get through the ranges and to a place called the Reynolds Range further north, but basically onto Mulga Flat. And he did a remarkable job. At the age of 25, leading a team of men, he got his section completed by the end of 1871, and the deadline, the contract had been signed with the British Telegraph, the British company laying the cable. They had to have the line finished by the 31st of December 1871, and Mills certainly met his part of the deal. He got his section done, but there was disaster in the north, and so actually the line didn't get built, didn't get opened in time because of problems with the flooding of the top end wet season that really made things tough. But anyway, he did everything that was asked of him. And then he moved north to help the men in the north, and a few of the men stayed behind. And so we're now no longer on the 11th of March, 1871. We've moved on to November. And that's when a team of men who were left behind began building a stone telegraph station. And this is the earliest image of the Alice Spring telegraph repeating station. And it was completed in July of 1872. In the years that followed, the telegraph station gradually grew in size and became a little village. And nowadays the buildings are restored, and it's a historic precinct, part of a broader national park. So this building with the chimney is the original telegraph building built between November 1871 and July 1872. The building in the background is a store built a little bit later, but you can see the country around there. And that's a flagpole, by the way, not a telegraph pole in the picture. The building in this slide is the actual Post and Telegraph Office that was built later. And to the left, you can see the insulators on a pole taking power from a battery room. And there's the building from a northern perspective looking south. And in the background, the pink range is the main range. And out of the picture to the right is the gap in Turripa, or Heavitree Gap, that Mills found, which is now a significant gateway to the town. But before we talk about that a little bit more, in 1888, a town was gazetted 4 kilometres south of the telegraph station, and that is the township of Alice Springs now. So the telegraph station was separate from what grew up to be the town. And this image of Alice Springs is taken in 1894. It grew very quickly because a little bit of gold had been discovered out to the east, but it was more a gold trickle than a gold rush. There was never the amount of gold found that was found in Ballarat and Bendigo in the mid 1800s. But so this is the town of Alice Springs in 1894. And so Heavitree Gap, that Mills had named, lost its Turripa name very quickly. Most people wouldn't know it anymore, though a few of us go out of our way to try and educate people about the names. But it became the main gateway to the town. And here's the train named the Gan after the Afghan Cameleers coming through. And here's an aerial shot looking north through Heavitree Gap into the town itself, which has grown to 25,000 people. And not only does the railway go through that gap now, but also is a major road going through. So it gives you a bit of an idea for people who've never visited Alice Springs, basically what has happened in the days since Mills rode with 2 other men through that country. Now, what is significant is that, of course, for the Arunta people, and they're the Aboriginal people speaking a particular language, Arunta, of the Alice Springs area, their life was never the same again after the advent of the telegraph being built through. Relations between the Arunta people and the telegraph men were actually very good, because Charles Todd had stipulated to his men manning his isolated little stations that they were to respect the Aboriginal people, they were not to go to their camps, they were not to cohabit with the women, they were to honour their possessions and respect them. Things only changed when a new breed of people came to the centre with the arrival of cattle, but we'll talk about that in a second. So the enduring legacy of Mills' ride from Heavitree Gap up the river to the Alice Spring on the 11th of March 1871 was that the Aboriginal people's lives were changed forever. They got clothes, they got cattle, and they got religion. they got Christianity. But it was undoubtedly the arrival of the cattle 2 years after Mills' ride up the river that had the most drastic impact on the way they lived. The Aboriginal people had thought the country belonged to them, but they were sadly mistaken. It was carved up and leased to white people with money from the south. And I'm sorry to say, with great respect to my English friends, the British Empire had extended its clutches into the heart of this country, and English law now applied, not the traditional law of the Aboriginal people. So we should say God save the Queen, God save Victoria, but really, poor help the bloody Aboriginal people. The poor buggers were considered expendable, and the cattle more than the Telegraph was what changed their life in future years to come. Now, what about young Mills? Well, he worked in the Territory until the end of 1872 and a little bit beyond, and then he returned to Adelaide. But interestingly, he couldn't get permanent work with the Survey branch. So he did a range of other things, and he set up his own private practice in Jeffcott Street, North Adelaide in 1876. And that's a lovely part of Adelaide, and he worked there. I often stay with family in that part of town. So north of Adelaide, not far from the city, he set up his own consulting business as a surveyor. And interestingly, his younger brother, Harry, arrived in South Australia 2 years later in 1878, and he also became a licensed surveyor. Young William married Mary Jane Mullen on the 24th of March, 1879. So that's 8 years after he was in the Alice Springs area. And they had two daughters, Alice and Ethel. He ran a camel transport business for a while in the 1880s. But sadly, Mary Jane died on the 1st of October, 1888. So that's, roughly a decade after they were married. She was only 30 years of age. And what young Mills did, he was still a young bloke, he left his daughters in the care of relatives and he moved to Broken Hill in Western New South Wales, where he worked as a surveyor until 1891. And at that stage, 1891, a fabulous find of gold had been found in the Kalgoorlie and Coolgardie areas of Western Australia, and still the richest gold mines in Australia. So he left the silver, lead and zinc mines of Broken Hill in Western New South Wales, and he went to the goldfields of Western Australia. And he ended up staying there for the rest of his life. And he died on the 19th of August, 1916, at his camp near the Kalgoorlie area, aged 72. And his two daughters were brought up by relatives. Now, a descendant of one of those daughters is a fella who's actually going to be coming to Alice Springs in a week's time for the commemoration of Mills' exploits. So it's been good to connect with a descendant of Mills. I've only spoken to him on the phone, but I'll be interested in telling you what I can learn from him and what he knows. Though again, he doesn't know much about the young time of Mills, only his later days. Now, what became of the OT line, the Overland Telegraph line, the Singing Wire? Oh, I should mention that there is a street named after Mills on the east side of Alice Springs in an area devoted to explorers of the country. So while Mills is not a household name in Heavitree or Plymouth where he was born, he's certainly well known in the town of Alice Springs and commemorated with Mills Street on the east side of town running off the Todd River. The telegraph line it changed dramatically life in Australia, giving immediate communication with the outside world from the time it was finished in 1872. It wasn't instantaneous like texting is, but very similar. But it took about 6 or 7 hours to get a message from Australia to London, for example. And that was because it had to be transmitted manually, and there were lots of repeating points along the way. But still, to get a message to England and back in 6 hours was pretty remarkable compared to 6 months in a ship beforehand. Unfortunately, most Australians don't even know that this great overland telegraph line even exists, and people in the centre of Australia are certainly aware. And this is an image of me south of Alice Springs in some heavy sand dune country, and you can see the line snaking away with 2 insulators. Originally there was just the one wire, but a second wire was added in 1898 to improve the communication. Some of the poles are wobbly, but they will survive. They're not heritage listed, and we are trying to get them listed. but because they're off the beaten track, most people don't know where they are, and they'll be preserved for a while longer until we can somehow get some protection in place. And that's the sort of country you've got to drive through to get to the remnants of the line which are well off the track. So as I said earlier, while Alice Springs is mountain country and quite a rich oasis, it's surrounded by desert. And this is south of Alice, about an hour and a half drive. You get into that red sandy desert. So it is really a genuine oasis. And here's some intrepid explorers. The baldy-headed bloke towards the right, second from the right, is me. As we traced some of these poles, and so some of my mates and I now in retirement have done a lot to document what we can of the line. So William Whitfield Mills played a key role in this, and the actual section that he built through the Mcdonald Rangers doesn't exist, but fortunately there are other parts built by other teams that are still surviving like this one, and he is remembered. And in 2016, Wakefield Press published a book I wrote called Alice Springs from Singing Wire to Iconic Outback Town. And I left a couple of copies in Heavitree that I hope people will appreciate and can learn a little bit more about the people involved. And I certainly look forward, when this COVID times are over, being able to fly back to England to poke around Plymouth and see if we can work out a little bit more about Mills' early days. Because just recapping, as I said before, he may not be well known in Heavitree, where he spent a bit of time, but he's certainly a significant figure in the heart of Australia. And it's been a pleasure to share a little bit about him before I jump in my car and head to Alice Springs, halfway across the continent. It's only 3,000 kilometres, to be at the Alice Spring on the morning of the 11th of March as we celebrate the work he did 150 years ago.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much, Stuart. That was absolutely amazing. Well, I'm completely blown away, because I've seen you present before on this topic, but that was just so beautifully put together. And I think with that range of images, which allows us to put our minds into such a different landscape. Yeah, thank you so much. I think the people here in Heavitree are going to be so moved that you've taken the time and shared your experience and expertise with us.
Jojo, it took me all day to do it and select the images and scan pictures, but it was a work of pleasure, which is why I was getting cranky over the weekend when we couldn't get bloody Zoom. I thought, I've gone to all this trouble. But you're dead right. I wanted to show people what the centre was like. And the important message you can pass on is those mountains in the middle. I mean, it's a mountainous, dry area surrounded by desert, but that shows the challenge that Mills had. I mean, the trouble of getting across that is, and I didn't mention this in the talk, but they had 2,000 sheep with them. There was 100 odd men to build the central section. They had 2,000 sheep for fresh meat. They had 140 camels. They had 100 horses pulling heavy drays and things. So finding a suitable pass to take all that heavy equipment and livestock was a main thing. But also, it wasn't just about a pass and needing water. They also needed to find feed. And what was really fortunate at the time was it was an unusually wet year, a wet couple of years. So the country was at its best, and but still an extraordinary achievement by your bloke from Heavitree, if we can find out more about him. But it's a pleasure.
Okay, can I ask you to, I'll stop recording right now.